everyone, I'm Chris Lynch from News Talk ZB and CTV News. It's great to have you here. A good turnout, which is good.
You should have had a green tie.
What?
You should have had a green tie.
A green tie. No, National's not here, so I thought I'd represent them with my tie. Joke. So thanks so much for coming tonight. In a way, there's probably a sense that the politicians you're about to meet are preaching to the converted, but even I myself have learnt some interesting facts, information from doing research on who are our guests tonight. First of all, let me acknowledge this event tonight is hosted by It's Our Future Christchurch. They say they're dedicated to informing the general public about the TPPA and the fight against what it describes as the loss of democracy in New Zealand. Let me make it quite clear, I'm apolitical. I'm not here today to have a position. I'm here to make sure the politicians shut up after 3 or 4 minutes. What else can I tell you? This is a rather interesting subject matter because it's almost one that's hard to debate given the fact that not many people know much about it. But I guess the interesting points, even some of those on the right have conceded that there are some major concerns when it comes to medication, how much it will cost you in the future. Although Prime Minister John Key has said many times that it won't cost you anymore, he's since changed his tune, which in a way is interesting in itself. So we'll get what our politicians have to think on that as well. Not quite sure in terms of timing. There may be a chance to ask questions at the end depending on how we go, but we are here for limited time, so I will stop talking. Tonight, first of all, could you please give a warm welcome to our guests, and we'll bring them up on stage one by one. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Labour MP David Parker. God, maybe turn your microphones on once they get here because you're going to get feedback when they walk past the speaker. All right, in no particular order in terms of how wonderful they are, the Māori Party's Marama Fox is with us. No feedback.
No, well, I was going to say that if it was an order of how wonderful they are, I would have been first, but that's okay.
Yeah. Sorry,
I don't mind sharing.
I'm training. New Zealand First's MP Fletcher Taputo.
Tableto.
And Greens co-leader Russell Norman.
No, not anymore.
Well, used to be. As you can see, there's one missing chair here. The organisers made repeated invitations to the government representatives. They chose not to either respond or reject. So I will sit here only as a host. All right. So there is there's one question, but there are specific questions I'm going to ask each and every one of you. So we probably know what your stance is on the TPP. So in a way, the first question really is, what is your party's stance on the TPPA and why has your party taken its position? So that's sort of the first question, but the second question is quite specific, so I'll get you to answer both in 4 minutes and you can go for gold. So David, let me start with you. What are your concerns about the TPP, specifically in regards to New Zealand's ongoing housing crisis? And your 4 minutes starts now.
Well, we're quite unashamedly a party that believes in trade. We believe in free and fair trade. We're quite proud of the Chinese Free Trade Agreement, and we think that it's obvious that New Zealand is better off if we're trading with other nations. We can't consume all the milk that we produce, or we probably produce a bit much of that at the moment. But most of what it is that we produce, we need to sell to the world in order to pay for the things like cars and computers and TVs that we want to import. So if we can have better terms of trade that mean that we lose less of that to taxes as things are going into other countries where they have a tariff at the border, then that's good for New Zealand's economy. But our concerns under the TPP are summarised on this piece of red paper that I've handed around, is that this agreement is more than a trade agreement. It has a lot of investment protocols, and the devil is in the detail of these, which we're not allowed to see because the government's not being transparent enough. a lot of the other details will come out during the discussion, so I won't go into the other concerns that we have. One of the things that vexes me, and vexes me very strongly personally, is the idea that we could lose the sovereignty to control who is allowed to buy our land. I believe strongly that the right to buy your land should be a privilege that attaches to the people who've got a right to live there. It shouldn't be priced on an international market. And those people who've got a right to live here, it's anyone who's got citizenship or residency, however long they've been here. If they've just arrived, they can buy. If they've been born here, they can buy. But if they live overseas and aren't a resident or a citizen, they can't. Now, for me, that's important for a number of reasons. One is I believe in social mobility, and I think that successful New Zealanders who work hard and save should be able to buy our assets, and I don't think they should be priced out through people who bring lots of money from overseas, who in reality are the 1%. They're the wealthiest 1% in the world. This amazing concentration of wealth that we're seeing in every country in the world, really, in the top 1%, whether it's America or China or Europe or Greece. Greeks are in London at the moment buying up the 1%ers. They've taken their money out of Greece, spending it there. And I just think that is wrong. I think those things ought to be within the control of a government to ban if they want to. And we know that the current government's mucked that up with the South Korean Free Trade Agreement, notwithstanding that Australia has the right to ban South Koreans from buying land in Australia, and they've protected that in their free trade agreement. The current national government have sold out that right, and if you were to adhere to the terms of that free trade agreement, that is in breach of the South Korean Free Trade Agreement to have a ban on South Koreans buying land here. And because of the wording of what are common clauses in free trade agreements, most favoured nation clauses, that flows through to the benefit of China. So you can see that the government's mistakes are tying the hands of a future government, and we think that's wrong. We don't want to be tenants of our own country. The final thing I'll say on that is I think that's actually something that runs to the heart of a lot of New Zealanders. A lot of New Zealanders came to New Zealand to get a country where they could have a stake in. They didn't want to be tenants of absentee landowners. And you know, I think that's a very proper value to hold dear. And if we keep high rates of home ownership, they're the lowest since the 1950s and still dropping. It's a great insurance policy against inequality in old age. It's one of the reasons why we've got low rates of elderly poverty in New Zealand, is that most of the elderly own their own homes and therefore have a secure financial situation as they get older.
Thank you, David. What does the yellow card represent again?
1 minute.
1 minute, and red is shut up.
Yep.
Thank you.
Right.
You did well. You still had a minute left. Next question is for Russell Norman. What are your concerns about the TPPA when it comes to environment, GE, food safety, biosecurity, and the RMA? And your 4 minutes starts now.
Thank you, tēnā koutou. It's great to be here, and thanks to It's Our Future for putting this on tonight, and thanks to all of you for coming out. One way to think about the TPP and the discussion we're having about it globally, because it's not just an issue for New Zealand, is that we're debating what should be the rules of global governance. Because we need some rules for global governance, and none of us here are saying there shouldn't be any rules. I support action on climate change. I want a set of global rules about restricting greenhouse emissions. And so we're all in favour of some kind of form of global governance or a set of rules that will regulate the way the world works. It's just a question of what those rules should be. And that's really the debate here. And so if you think about the kind of rules that are being proposed in the TPP, they're the kind of rules that would put in place a whole bunch of restrictions on the ability of governments to act on our behalf. And so I just want to give one example, and that's about nuclear power. So the thing about nuclear power is those people who like nuclear power think it's got a lot of upsides. You know, it's a pretty regular power source, arguably low in carbon. Those who don't like nuclear power can point to a lot of downsides. So I went up to Fukushima a couple of years ago, and I was in the restricted period area, which is 20 kilometres radius around that nuclear power plant, and there's nobody living there. And if you go to Japan, of course, Japan's really densely populated, so to drive for 20 kilometres and see nobody but all these deserted villages and rice paddy fields is pretty extraordinary. And so there's a lot of problems in nuclear power. And so Something like nuclear power and the regulation around nuclear power is a hotly contested issue in a democracy, as it should be, and the rules on it can change over time. So after the Fukushima disaster, the German government, the Conservative government in Germany, decided, right, that's it. Well, we've now decided we want to phase out nuclear power. And so they should be allowed to do that because they've decided something's happened, the Fukushima disaster happened, and they decided they wanted to phase it out. Now the thing is that when they decided to do that, the owners of nuclear power stations saw that as a significant threat to their business. And they'd be right in assuming that. And they said, well, we could have made a lot of money in the decades and century ahead selling nuclear power to Germans, and the fact that you've now decided to phase it out is going to be very expensive to us. And actually, they've got a point. And so what they did was Vattenfall, which is an energy company, sued the German government for 7 billion New Zealand dollars because it said, well, it's going to be very expensive for us if you phase out nuclear power. Now, the exact terms of this case we don't know because it's an investor-state dispute. An investor, Vattenfall, a nuclear power company, is suing a state, the German government, because that government made a decision that will cost that company money. Now that is the kind of regulatory framework that is being set up by the TPP under these kind of investor-state disputes resolutions. And it is all about restricting the ability of democratic governments to make decisions about things like nuclear power, which they had the support of the German people to make that decision, but now they are under enormous pressure because of the cost or potential cost to the German government of making that decision. And so what it means is that once these agreements get locked in place, governments in those kind of situations all around the world will look at making decisions that might protect the environment and go, what if we get sued? How much will it cost us? Are we really sure we want to make this decision if we get sued for billions of dollars in one of these secret international tribunals? And that's why getting these rules around these treaties, the kind of global governance that we want to put in place, are so critically important, and that's why we're so opposed to the kind of clauses that are in this TPP. Thank you.
Nicely done. Perfect timing. Very good. All right, the next question goes to Marama Fox. Obviously, Māori have concerns relating to the TPP, sovereignty and the Treaty of Waitangi issues. Can you outline your concerns? And your time starts now.
Kia ora. Which is good to have a timekeeper because I could enact my customary rights to mihi for 20 minutes before we get started. But I'll save us all from that. So, yes, obviously we have concerns. We've had concerns from the start. And our concerns are, the thing is I'm not a TPP expert. I've read the conspiracy theories, I've read a whole lot of information about it, but the point is we actually don't know. We don't know what's in there, and that is concerning. How can we sign up to something and agree to something if we have no idea what we're signing up to? Now, a lot of people have been concerned about giving away our sovereignty. So if multinational corporations are able to sue our government for things, and even in this case, they're suing the Australian government, and so that's hamstrung our government to make a decision about plain packaging. So they're not even, we haven't even signed it yet, and we're already stopping the things that we want to do in our own country to support our own decision making, which is our sovereignty, our rangatiratanga. So this is something that Māori know a little bit about, obviously. So there's that whole debate. Did we sign away our sovereignty by signing the Treaty of Waitangi? And a lot of people say yes, because it clearly says that. Well, in Māori it clearly doesn't. And so we have this debate. And you imagine, we've been debating this now for 175 years. Imagine how long we will debate and hold things up in courts of law across the world if we sign away our sovereignty through this deal. Now, are we going to do that? Maybe not. The government is saying that's silly. Of course we won't do that. But actually, when we sign up fair trade agreements, or free trade agreements I should say, then we are giving the power to the multinational corporations. We are giving them more power than we are giving ourselves, and that's what people are afraid of. Now, we do not agree with anything that we can't see the details of. I believe in fair trade, as David Parker has pointed out, not free trade, fair trade. Now, we have a free trade agreement with Taiwan. Inside that, there is a little chapter for Indigenous free trade, and that is about trying to have a social responsibility. So when we operate these companies, if we have a social responsibility, we have a greater distribution of wealth. So it's not just the 1% who are signed up, locked in, going to take all the benefits of a free trade agreement. But if you have a fair trade agreement, you ensure that you have a greater distribution of wealth so that all people can benefit together. Because what is the point in living in a world where we have an equal rates of obesity and poverty? What sort of world do we live in when we have a disease of obesity because we eat too much of the dumb food, and we also have a place of poverty where people cannot find a home? We need to have a better distribution of wealth. We will not sign up to an agreement that signs away our sovereignty. And the last thing I want to say is Y262. It is a Waitangi Tribunal claim that has been around for a very long time, and it's because a small marae on the east coast of New Zealand wanted to start a trade in karingo, which is seaweed. They went to collect it. They looked into patenting it, and they found out that a pharmaceutical company already had the rights to our native flora and fauna in this country. And then they found out that they actually had the rights to another 14-ish plants, native plants of New Zealand.
Why are you supporting the government then?
Kia ora, good question. The thing is that we retain our independence. We can vote against the government
All right.
anytime we like.
We're out of time. Thank
that's
you.
why we're there. Is that a red card?
It's a red card.
All right, I'm sitting.
As I say, depending on time, there might be a chance to take some questions from the floor. Next question is to Fletcher. Please give us your position on the ISDS. You might need to explain that as well, and your bill to essentially challenge this.
Yeah, thank you everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. I'm Fletcher Tabuto with New Zealand First, and I'm not sure how many of you are aware. I think we are preaching to the converted tonight, but I, as a Member of Parliament, brought a private member's bill to the House called Fighting Foreign Corporate Control. So New Zealand First was the only party that tried to battle this TPP negotiations with actual legislation. And the intent of the law was to remove the investor-state dispute settlement provision from the TPP. It was a start. There's certainly a lot wrong with the TPP. So certification, for example, is an insidious way of controlling what we do within our legislation, and hopefully I'll get a chance to talk about that later. But the investor-state disputes provision, Russell touched on it, and what you're talking about is not access for all businesses, whether they're New Zealand or multinationals, international companies, access to sue if the government makes a bad decision. What you're talking about is a secret tribunal process. Now, many of you will know that. So it doesn't exist in law. It doesn't have an appellate system, so there's no right of appeal from the government. Only the corporate can take the government to the tribunal. The government can't take the corporate to the tribunal, and it's made up of 3 people. It's made up of 3 corporate lawyers. That's the investor states process. So it's not a wonderful international court. Like you could argue the state-to-state, the WTO organisation that presided over the apple exporting to Australia for the New Zealand apple market was an open process. But the ISDS provision is not. And so New Zealand First has absolutely opposed the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement from the start. And our main reasoning for that was, as Marama said, how can you even begin to support a process that lacks transparency, is in fact quite secret? And when I asked for ministry officials to brief me on the TPP, they gave me some nice general amenities. They just spoke in generalities and convinced me how wonderful it would be for everyone. But there is trade, and New Zealand First does support trade, despite our history in the House. We haven't yet supported a trade deal. We do support trade. We understand how important it is. But when you include the likes of certification, which we assume is in it because we've seen some leaked documentation, but when you have the ISDS provision, you cannot, in all consciousness, support a trade deal that absolutely takes away a country's right to make sovereign decisions on behalf of the people of this country. So I spoke for 15 minutes in the House only a couple of weeks ago about that very thing, and I accused the backbench of the National Party for daring to debate with me in the first place, knowing nothing about the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, because if you ask them to come and speak tonight, their go-to response will be, we don't know the details. And yet they stood up and just inanely debated the Fighting Foreign Corporate Control Bill and told us it would compromise all those wonderful dollars that we get from trade. I'm all for the wonderful dollars that we get from trade, but the cost is too high, and New Zealand First cannot support the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and one of the main reasons is the ISDS provision. Thank you.
All right, folks, the next question is about medicines and the medical world here in New Zealand. You have 3 minutes to answer this, or shorter. I've paraphrased it, but I know you're all well aware of what the actual question is. But for the benefits of time, the question is this, and we'll start with Marama. I'm not going to read the whole thing, it's all right. Essentially, the question is, doctors and nurses and their professional organisations have criticised the clauses in the TPP that gives multinational pharmaceutical companies patent protections that would prevent Pharmac from buying lower-cost generic medicines. Do you share their concerns, despite the Prime Minister earlier last week saying the government will pick up the tab for the additional costs? And your 3 minutes starts now.
Kia ora. Well, of course we share their concerns. This is exactly what I was pointing to with the Y262 claim. In fact, that claim was taken to the Waitangi Tribunal to try and get it debated under urgency, or to get a decision under urgency. And they rejected the opportunity to do that because they said, we have no detail. We don't know what we're looking at and whether that is a law or not, whether it's going to be law or not. We don't know whether the pharmaceutical companies are going to be doing this and taking away patents. What we already know is that in this country it has already happened. Right? We've already sold away our patents to some of our native flora and fauna. And in order for us to get drugs cheap in this country, we need to have them funded by Pharmac, and we're not going to have the opportunity to do that. So that's our point, isn't it? That's the entire point, is that if we don't know, how can we debate it fairly and properly? So we're speculating, but if we're already doing this type of thing in this country by selling away the rights to our native flora and fauna, then we are removing our sovereignty, and I can't see that this deal will protect that any more than it already is not being protected now. So in fact, we oppose that. We oppose this, and we absolutely agree with the nurses and the doctors in this country who say that this will not help us provide the care and the pharmaceuticals, the drugs needed to keep our people safe and healthy. I mean, why are we not investing in our own development of these things, using our own native flora and fauna to see if we can find, we've been world leaders in cancer treatments and all of those sorts of things. We need to be investing in our own people, our own research and development companies to find pharmaceuticals, drugs that will help our people and protect our native flora and fauna and the valuable things that are in them. We know the benefits from manuka honey, for example, and we're only just scraping the very surface of what we don't know. So, you know, I don't support it. I'll never support it. Invest the money in our own country and our own people to develop our own pharmaceutical drugs so that we can keep our people healthy and safe. Kia ora.
David Park, I want to pick up on some information that suggests oncologist George Laking asks whether we are likely to earn enough from the agreement to be able to pay 16 times the current cost of cancer treatment. The drug companies argue that they need this anti-competitive protection so they can afford to do the research, yet it is widely known that the drug companies currently spend more on advertising and promotion than they do on research. So at what point does the moral question around withholding life-saving drugs begin to challenge the so-called profit imperative? And I guess it's a fair question.
It's a very fair question. The government's already said, and I actually believe them on this, that the fundamental Farm Act model is not going to be traded away. That would even be too silly for the National Party. They know that they would lose the next election if they did so. But what is at risk is that extensions to the period of patent or broadening of the scope of what you can patent could increase the amount of things that are on patent and therefore put up the cost because you can't buy cheaper alternatives like generics. Now, my answer to this is that I think most of us in this room realise that patents and copyright have their place. It's not fair if someone writes a book and then someone the next day can photocopy it down at the shop and the person that spent 10 years writing their magnus opus can't get a cent for it because someone else can rip it off for 10 cents down the road. That's not fair. Similarly, it's not fair if a drug company spends millions of dollars to produce a drug and then can get ripped off by someone producing a generic. And why society would be worse off in both of those cases if you didn't have copyright or patent is that fewer people would write a book or produce a song and fewer medicines would be investigated and brought to market under the current model that we have. And there are alternative models, but this is the model that the world currently has. Nonetheless, extensions to the term of patent or copyright do not accord with the underlying philosophy that backs it up, because no one produces a song or an architectural drawing or an engineering drawing or a medicine on the basis that they're going to get an extra bit of revenue in the case of copyright 70 years after the death of the author instead of 50 years after the death of the author. People just aren't motivated by that, and in accounting terms, what is the current value of those future returns way out in the distance is so small that it doesn't motivate human behaviour. So these extensions that are driven by the Americans are because they own most of the intellectual property and they want to make more money from what is already in existence rather than trying to create more. And that's why the New Zealand government should be pushing hard against these extensions to copyright and patent. Where they'll get to on that, we just don't know because we haven't seen the text.
Thank you, David. Another question again? And you're fine.
So just in terms of the potential benefit, so the USDA, the US Department of Agriculture, did an analysis where they said, okay, what if all of the partners to the TPP in agriculture, they remove all the tariffs in agriculture and they remove all the trade-related quotas, so you're allowed to send a certain amount of tonnes to different countries. What would be the benefit? They said if it was a fantastic result, which isn't the perfect result we're going to get, they said what would be the benefit? And so the benefit to New Zealand in 2025 would be 0.01% of GDP. Right? So it's absolutely marginal, the benefit to New Zealand, even if they got everything they asked for in terms of agricultural access. It's relatively minor in the big scheme of things, 0.01% of GDP. The thing about the kind of stuff around Pharmac is that Pharmac is, as far as the drug companies are concerned, Pharmac is a cancer, right? It's a disease that's got onto the world somehow and they want to kill the thing. And so in the AUS FTA, the agreement between Australia and the United States, their free trade agreement, their scheme over there, which is similar to Pharmac but not as good, the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme, PBS, was the number one target of that negotiation. How do we kill the PBS was the number one concern of the trade negotiators when they did the deal with Australia. And so they actually did put enormous restrictions on the PBS. Has the amount of research that's being conducted by drug companies in Australia increased as a result of the AUS FTA? No. There is no more research going on in Australia into new drugs as a result of the fact that they've put a bit of a noose around the PBS to restrict it. And so they want to put a restriction around Pharmac because Pharmac, it's not so much the money they lose in New Zealand, we're a pretty small market, that's the truth of it. But if the Pharmac model was very widely adopted around the world, it would cost the drug companies money. So they want to do everything they possibly can to try to control the Pharmac model. because it's so effective. It works. It's a great model. It's a great invention out of New Zealand, like the ACC system. With all the problems of ACC, it's a great system. And so that's really what the negotiation is all about in terms of from the American drug company's point of view. In terms of the benefits to New Zealand, it's pretty marginal. Even to the extent that, you think about the kind of benefits that New Zealand is really going for in terms of agriculture, it's about access for milk powder. Now, really? Is that what we should be doing as an economy, right? Focusing more on finding more customers for milk powder? Is that really going to get the New Zealand economy out of the problem that it's got itself into by focusing too much on a single commodity, by getting more access for that single commodity? I just don't think that that's the fundamental challenge facing the New Zealand economy.
Thank you. Richard.
So I just want to pick up where Russell left off. So that 0.01% was of the benefit in 2025 to trade to New Zealand in agriculture. And I did a quick calculation, and I fully admit it could be wrong. But the sum total of the benefit from trade and agriculture, according to that research done by the Agricultural Department of the US, in 2025 totaled approximately $25 million in extra revenue, which was... So that is completely negligible. And the cost of having to subsidise FarmAct so that we can continue to provide at current levels was, again, an estimate, $80 million a year. So there is just no balancing act there at all. So what the TPP does and what it sets out to achieve, and I posit that it is mainly for the American traders, is to remove these non-trade barriers. So what a lot of you will not realise is that in the same document they've asked for Fonterra to basically be dismantled. They argue that Fonterra is a government-endorsed and government-created monopoly, which creates huge distortions in the world market, which gives Fonterra an unfair advantage to world trade. So let's just picture the possibility of them getting what they want. Talk about national losing an election if they actually allowed that to happen. But if the TPP negotiators, who have been riding America's side of the negotiations for 6 years now, and apparently Gross has come in with our position in the last 4 weeks, and I put it to you, he would have signed it. He would have signed it. I don't care what was put in front of him, he would have signed it. But it was thankfully Japan, Canada, America, who have such ridiculous subsidised agricultural industries, couldn't come to an agreement. So the reality is you cannot ask New Zealanders to pay more for medicines. And for National to actually say that don't worry, we'll just take tax money from somewhere else and give it to medicines. Well, it just doesn't ring true to their core philosophy. It doesn't sound like National at all. So there's another reason. I completely agree with the medical practitioners and what they had to say. We just cannot support it. And there's another good reason why we cannot sign this agreement.
Thank you, Fletcher. Okay, the next question is this. There's been a lot of concern in the agreement that well-funded multinational companies like Philip Morris, just take one example, will be able to sue the New Zealand government if we legislate for argument's sake, plain cigarette packaging, or continue to prevent GE foods from being widely planted. I'll read the rest of that to another panellists, but in the meantime, does your party have a plan to prevent this? And what happens when there is the potential for a lawsuit by overseas corporations and their demands? What can you possibly do? Let's start with Dr. Russell Norman. And this is the same time, 3 minutes, and it starts now.
I'm sure most of you know about the current case against Australia with Philip Morris, right? So Australia tries to introduce, as was talked about earlier, tries to have plain packaging of tobacco. Now, Philip Morris has got a point, right? Philip Morris, I mean, I was a smoker for many years, right? You go and you buy your cigarettes, right? You go, I want Winnie Blue or whatever, I had B&H, whatever. So the intellectual property of a brand is valuable, right? When you go to buy your smokes, you ask for the brand, right? So the fact that we want to introduce laws that abolish all those brands really will damage the tobacco companies. Philip Morris is right. I mean, they will lose the value of their intellectual property. The question is, should governments and democratically elected governments on behalf of all of us be allowed to do this? And my answer is yes. There's a good public health purpose in getting rid of those brands so that they're basically useless to Philip Morris. And the thing is that under the investor-state disputes thing, there's a thing called fair and equitable treatment, right? And so what fair and equitable treatment means is that you basically can't change the rules halfway through. So Philip Morris invested all this money in its brands in Australia, and then somewhere along the track the Australian government wants to just change the rules and said, no, you can't use these brands. And so you have expropriated or indirectly expropriated the value of Philip Morris's investment. And actually it's true, you have. I mean, yeah, okay. Too bad. We're going to save a whole bunch of lives. And in a democracy, you should be allowed to do that. Right? So the Australian government's getting sued. It's getting sued under a particular bilateral investment treaty, which is just a treaty which is just about investment. It's the one signed between Hong Kong and Australia. And so it has a particular clause in it. There's 3,000 of these treaties right around the world now. There's over 3,000 treaties have these investment clauses in them. So Philip Morris picked the one that they thought they had the best chance of winning on, right? And they're suing them in this tribunal. It hasn't even gone to the tribunal yet. The Australian government has spent $50 million so far defending that decision, right? It hasn't had its first hearing because the Australian government's trying to get it struck down at its first hearing, right? So it hasn't even had its first hearing, which is a procedural hearing, before it even gets to the next hearings, which will be the actual substantive hearings. Already the Australian government has spent 50 million Australian dollars on the legal case just so that they have got the right to make a decision to stop people dying from lung cancer because of smoking. Right? That's how bad things have got to. That's what these things mean. And that's when I say it's all about the kind of rules of global governance we want to have in place. Do we want to have a set of rules in place that say governments aren't allowed to legislate to protect human health? And I say we shouldn't have that rule. We should have a rule in place that says governments can. And these kind of rules, when it costs you $50 million, this is just the beginning, it'll probably, God knows how much the case is going to cost all up. When it costs you that much money, it's a chilling effect on the ability or the willingness of governments to regulate to protect human health and the environment.
Marama, you're already about to pounce up. Look at that excitement.
Let's talk about
Look
smoking.
at you. Well, let me just say this first of all. Canada apparently has paid $223 million in legal fees for 35 lawsuits. It's a similar situation for some European governments, if not more, well over $1 billion. So what is your response to that? And if New Zealand runs the same risk, what can you do as a party, and what is your plan?
So obviously everything that Russell said is absolutely correct. We cannot allow another international company to determine what we want to do and live as a people. As a nation, we should be able to determine that for ourselves. We've said, and we've set a goal, that we want to be smoke-free Aotearoa 2025. Now, whether or not you're a smoker or you agree with that, that's the nation's goal at the moment. And we have supported that. But the government has already stalled just with the threat of action being taken against them. They're stalled waiting to see what the outcome will be so that they don't go all the way down that road of bringing in plain packaging and have to backtrack. Now, we should be able to determine for ourselves as a nation the way we want to live. Now, we've heard about the amounts of money Canada has forked out in trying to fight these cases that have been brought against them. No blinking multinational corporation should be allowed to do that. Where do we give them the bill for the amounts of money that we're spending on saving lives, on hospitals, on cessation for smoking, on smoking addiction, on addiction services, for a whole number of things? How do we give them the bill? Under this agreement, we can't. So how do they get to be battling us and we don't battle them? I say there's only one way to do it as a nation, and that's to give them the proverbial finger. The way we gave the United States the proverbial finger when they didn't want to tell us whether or not their warships had nuclear power. You know, how proud were we as a nation when we stood up to these international, big, huge, biggest power in the world and said, actually, if you're not going to abide by our rules, you can't come here. You know, and that kicked us in the teeth for a long time, and we lost trade over that. But is that okay? Are we okay about that? Are we prepared as a nation to say we're okay about that? I am. Because actually, do we need it? No. Do we need it? We need to think about our own value system though, don't we? Because we want to have profit margins. People are always driven by this free market and profit margins. We have to say that people are more important than profit margins, and then damn the consequences, and stand up for ourselves as a nation, say we can determine for ourselves the way we want to live. Kia ora.
Thank you.
These sorts of events are always fantastic because you always learn something new and the public learns something new. Fletcher and I sat on the select committee which was considering the South Korean Free Trade Agreement, and we specifically asked officials from the government as to whether there were any trade-related reasons for the delay in the plain packaging legislation, and the government, of which you were part, denied it.
So you've got to be at the table, then you get the real answer.
Well, I hope there's a reporter here, because that should be reported. That should be reported, that the Maori Party are now admitting that the reason that the plain packaging initiative that came from Tariana Turia and Hone Hauera was also quite forceful in it, is being delayed because of the government that she is part of being worried about investor-state dispute clauses. Because that has never been acknowledged before, and indeed it's been denied by the government. Can I? No. You did that to yourself. ISDS clauses, I agree with we actually voted for Fletcher's bill at first reading. It was voted down by the government. I don't say that all ISDS clauses are always bad. When you're dealing with a third world country which has got a corrupt judiciary, which is effectively in the pocket of the government, then if a New Zealand company is working in that country and they get gypped by someone, then they can effectively have their money stolen off them, and it might be your money because you might be a shareholder in them, or your KiwiSaver might be a shareholder in them, and they can have it stolen off them effectively, and you can have no remedy, which is why ISDS clauses, well drafted, protecting the right to regulate with third world countries are appropriate. In respect of first world countries, we've reached the position in the Labour Party that we would prefer that they weren't there, because we don't see the upside. We think state-to-state enforcement is enough, and relying upon the rule of law, which is well enforced in those first world countries. What's the greatest problem for me in respect of investor-state dispute things? Actually, I like international fora, I've got to say. I don't think that, I like the International Court of Justice. I think it's a shame that America's not part of it. I like having things like the Kyoto Protocol. America should be in it. Those sorts of international agreements under which you should have enforceable rules are a good thing for the world to overcome intractable world problems. If you had investor-state dispute resolution proceedings that had an independent judiciary rather than a lawyer who starts a trade lawyer and goes back to being a trade lawyer the next day, that would be a big step forward. But we don't have them at present, and so the criticisms of those are made, that have been made are real. I would though say New Zealand's never been sued under our investor-state dispute clauses. The worst ones in Canada were under the NAFTA agreement, which was a different form to the one that New Zealand uses. And even the one that Australia's getting sued on up in, is it Hong Kong, did you say? And Hong Kong is a different form to that which New Zealand uses. And, so we'd prefer not to have them, but they're not all as bad as is made out.
Okay, thank you, David. Fletcher, I'll just repeat. Have you answered this question? No, you haven't, have you? No, all right. I'll just read it one more time. So what is your party's plan on how to stop these types of disputes, and how will you possibly try to respond to pressure of lawsuits by overseas corporates and their demands?
So I could speak on this for half an hour because this is the
3
main...
minutes.
But I'll try and take 3 minutes. This is the main underlying principle of the Fighting Foreign Corporate Control Bill. So the whole premise is the assumption that businesses shouldn't be taking risk when they go out and invest overseas. But right-wing think tanks have said ISDS distorts market signals and incentivises risk-taking from large foreign corporates that would otherwise not have invested in a different country because the political risk was too great. So the ISDS provision, which purports to stand up for free trade and to facilitate more free trade around the world, actually distorts market signals and encourages risk-taking which should never have been taken in the first place. This is all assuming that you cannot actually act in good faith with the legislation that exists in your countries, respective countries. So Singapore and New Zealand, South Korea and New Zealand, some of the top 10 recognised judicial systems in the world, and South Korea asked for the ISDS. And yet they know that we have one of the best open judicial systems in the world, and they could use it if they had just cause. So that is the underlying assumption of why we need ISDS. We don't need it. We've touched on some great concepts and ideas. We don't need ISDS. ISDS, according to a lot of developed trading nations in the world, including France and Germany, the European Union, the European Commission, for example, has come out and categorically stated ISDS is dead. We need a new system for these kind of disputes and these issues that will arise through trade. But the reality is, having acknowledged they will arise, you cannot use a black box system where the call of the day is secrecy, without the right of appeal, with 3 corporate lawyers. Let's use an international court system which is transparent. We know why and how they came to their decision, and a government has the right of appeal, which we don't have at the moment. So there's a lot of underlying assumptions being made about trade itself. There is risk in trade, and businesses can mitigate that themselves without ISDS. So there's a lot of conversation to be had around that.
Thanks,
Thank
Richard.
you.
All right, before we move on to the next segment, I just want to get a steer from the boss, Jen. What time have we got the hall till?
Oh, yeah.
Wrap it just after 8?
Time.
All right.
Yep.
So just after 8 we wrap, or?
No, we can go through.
Oh, we'll go till midnight. How's that sound? You'd like that. All right, some questions from Facebook now, from the It's Our Future Christchurch group. The first one is directed at Dr. Russell Norman, and it reads, how will the TPP help us make changes we need to decrease carbon emissions, or will it?
Well, as I was saying earlier, I'm a supporter of global governance, right? It's similar to some of the things David was saying. So I support some kind of global agreements around climate change, for example. Obviously, the problem with the TPP is that it connects as a constraint on the ability of governments to regulate on climate change and lots of other things. So let me give you another example, another Vattenfall example, which is this energy company that I talked about earlier in Germany. There was a previous case where in Germany where Vattenfall wanted to build a coal-fired electricity generating plant, right, in Hamburg. And so they wanted to build the plant, and then the state government put a whole bunch of regulations on how they could do it because they wanted to restrict coal-fired plants, right? And so Vattenfall said, well, we don't really like the regulations that the state government has put on our coal-fired power plant. This is a very recent case. And so they sued Germany under ISDS, right? And so they sued them, I think it was 1.4 billion euros, because they said, oh, the environmental restrictions you've put on us are too constraining. We don't like them. So we're going to sue you because you're expropriating us. And it's not fair, it's not equitable, basically the German government backed down. It was settled out of court, so they didn't actually have to pay it any money. What they had to do was they had to loosen all the environmental constraints on the coal-fired power plant. And so the problem is that if governments are regulating in order to reduce greenhouse emissions, things like the TPPA reduce the tools that you have. And so that's the basic problem with them. There's some very interesting cases, for example, on solar production. So Canada, some of the Canadian states introduced the support for solar photovoltaics, but the rule was they had to be manufactured in Canada or have a certain amount of it manufactured in Canada. And they lost a case, a trade case on that issue. Now, the interesting thing about that is, often the reason why you can sell, say, subsidising solar to a community, because you have to use taxpayers' money to do it, is you go, well, it will generate local jobs by putting in local content rules. But, of course, local content rules breach trade obligations because you're not allowed to discriminate against overseas producers. Now, you might say, well, you shouldn't be allowed to discriminate against overseas producers. I mean, that's an argument, and some might make that. But in terms of being able to sell, taking action on climate change to a domestic population, you want to show the upsides as well, right? Not only that there's a cost in terms of the subsidy you're providing to these solar producers, but there's an upside in terms of local employment and all that kind of stuff as well. So it does constrain the kind of tools that you have to take action on things like climate change.
Thank you. I've just realised that question was for anybody really, but I just thought naturally it would probably go to you. It's actually the next question, but anyway. In the spirit of balance, does anyone else want to respond or add to that? David.
I absolutely agree. You've got to keep the right to regulate, which is effectively what Russell's saying. Fletcher and I sat on the select committee, as I was saying, for South Korea. No doubt that under that agreement, New Zealand could increase the price on carbon or regulate to introduce a price on irrigation water takes or hydro uses or regulate in the name of public health. So I agree you've got to be really careful, but I also think it's proper that I don't stand here and agree that all trade agreements have that effect, because if they're properly drafted, they don't have to have that effect.
Sure, Fletcher.
So one of the problems with ISDS is the black box process. So we've fundamentally take a different position to Labor's stance, which says there are some good ISDS. And I said it in my speech in the House for Fighting Foreign Corporate Control. Completely acknowledge that New Zealand has never been sued. No international corporate has decided to go down the ISDS route. When they have had a problem, they have used our local judiciary. They've gone to court, which is fantastic. But the reality is with ISDS, and we've said it here and you know it, it's a black box, it's secret, and there's no right of appeal. So there are countries who do have what they think are solid ISDS provisions within their trade agreements that look and sound like ours, but they have been successfully sued and they have had to dole out the money, and they have lost and they haven't been able to appeal. I just wanted to add one more example. So Canada has recently had to withstand a suit from an American corporate, for mining in Canada. And the issue there was the central government and some other regions in Canada have let this kind of mining go ahead. But this regional council, by comparison, or for example, said, no, this isn't the moral or value code of our region, and we won't let you do that. But Bilcon sued, and, under the fair and equitable treatment provision within it, they won the case. So, it's dangerous. ISDS is dangerous.
Okay, another question from Facebook, and it's to all the panellists tonight. It's been suggested free market does not deliver the results it promises. The Australian National University's School of Public Policy states that the Australia/US Free Trade Agreement destroyed 53 billion Australian dollars. Could New Zealand businesses be disadvantaged by the TPP? Marama.
I'll tell you who is disadvantaged by the TPP and free trade agreements such as this, and that is Joe Ordinary New Zealander. Because what all of these agreements do aim to have a free market, and free market means let the market determine. And lots of people who have investment companies, lots of people who own big companies, they're going, that's great, because then I can have a greater profit margin, we can make more money, and we can go holiday in France or whatever. But who doesn't get the benefit of these free trade agreements? It's the people who work at the coalface, on the shop floor, who are being paid in this country the equivalent of a poverty wage, because there is no doubt that $14.75 is actually, you're working to be impoverished. You work a whole week on minimum wage in this country, and you are working to the poverty line. When you add increases of accommodation and rent and all of those sorts of things on top of that, hardship factors by the government's own measurement that they actually like, because there's a whole lot of measurements that they try and dismiss because it means more people are captured in the poverty line, by their own measure that they like, the severe hardship index, 100,000 children are living in poverty, and they are 10% of this nation's children. Let's add their families to that, because you can't be an impoverished child without an impoverished parent, and so those are the people who are never going to benefit from these free trade agreements, because there's lots of people making a lot of money. That's great, but it's not trickling down. The trickle-down theory doesn't work, and until we address our own issues of poverty, and I want to say that it is within our grasp to do it now. If we let this go on any longer, it will be outside of our ability to control. And are we going to accept that as a nation? If we allow this type of agreement, any of these agreements, all of them have ups and downs, and as you say, some of them can be taken to court and some of them can't. You might win or you might not. But if we allow this continual drive to a free market economy to just dominate the way we do things, when we look at our nation's people as customers and not people, then we will continue to have a group of people who will always live in poverty in this country, and that's not right. So not at all costs should we be signing ourselves away to this type of free market agreement. And yes, I'm not against economic development, but at what cost? I believe we must have a social responsibility to any agreement, that there must be a fair trade agreement where people, everyday Joe ordinary people, are looked after. That's what I'm concerned about. Kia ora.
Just to repeat the question, could New Zealand businesses be disadvantaged by the TPP? David Parker.
So you'll see the bottom lines that are on that bit of paper that I've been handing out here, and they're pretty clear. The Protection of Farm Act, that's both the model and inappropriate cost increases. ISDS clauses must protect we'd prefer it not to be there. If it is there, you must protect the right to regulate across public health, environment, safety, etc., any other thing, even investment rules. We've got to maintain the right to control who owns our land. Treaty of Waitangi must be upheld. It is in all other trade agreements, and it should be in this one too. And meaningful gains must be made on tariff reductions. Now let's say all of those bottom lines are met. Then, there is an important decision to be taken, because the TPP does include countries that represent 40% of the world's output. And if New Zealand isn't in that agreement, but Australia, for example, is, or Mexico is, then New Zealand companies who are trying to sell to 40% of the world economy will be disadvantaged substantially in some industries. Not all industries, but in some industries. And those activities from New Zealand could wither. And with them, the export earnings and the jobs that go with them. And those industries, all things being equal, will have an economic incentive to relocate to another country to sell into the TPP countries on more competitive terms than we can offer. Now you might say that doesn't sound much, But when you face tariffs of, a couple of 100% sometimes, and I know dairy is at the moment the whipping boy, and I'm no great defender of the dairy industry. I think we've incentivised too much of that, and we allow them to put costs to the environment that ought to be borne by the dairy industry. But I still think it would be better off for New Zealand not to have big tariff barriers against the dairy products that we do produce into the rest of the world. So at that point, you actually have to do a cost-benefit analysis of whether the benefits exceed the costs, and you can't do that until you see the agreement. And so that's another reason why you need to have transparency from the government, so that we can have a proper assessment of whether the upside exceeds the downside if our bottom lines are met.
Thank you, David. Dr. Roster-Dorman, could New Zealand businesses be disadvantaged by the TPP given what's happened in the Australian and US free trade agreement?
So it's an interesting empirical question. I mean, does it benefit you to have a preferential trade agreement? Because that's what this is, right? This is a preferential trade agreement, right? It says we're going to preference trade by lowering tariff barriers, but there's not a lot left on our side, but around the world for a certain group of, what's that?
Ours average 2 or 3%.
Yeah, that's right. New Zealand has very little to trade, of course. It's part of the problem is because we unilaterally removed all these barriers in the past. But anyway, putting that to one side. So Australia and the United States have done a preferential trade agreement. So you would think that from Australia's point of view, no doubt it was sold in Australia that it would be enormously beneficial to Australia to enter this agreement. Australia's trade deficit has increased very substantially since the signing of the agreement. Now, it may be that there's lots of other things going on. I mean, the world economy is a complex thing, right? So it's not like the Australian-US trade agreement is the only thing affecting the trade balance between Australia and the United States, right? It's complex. But there is no question that the AUS-FTA has not fixed it. In fact, we know since the treaty was signed, it got worse, right? Okay, let's talk about another one, China and New Zealand. Now, this is always touted as the great, fantastic success of a trade agreement, right? So we know that since the signing of the trade agreement between New Zealand and China, basically the exports from New Zealand to China have increased 2.5-fold, a very significant increase, right, over that period. So that looks like a success. You go, okay, so why don't we look at other countries which didn't have a trade agreement with China over the same period? Australia, for example. Australia's exports increased 1.5-fold during that same period without any kind of trade agreement whatsoever. You look at all the commodity producing countries around the world, South Africa, Brazil, they all increased their exports into China dramatically during that period. They doubled it, right? So all around the world, commodity producing countries during the period that the China-New Zealand free trade agreement has been in place increased their exports into China dramatically. Now there's a really good reason for that. China went through a dramatic growth and was desperate for commodities, right? It sucked in iron ore and coal from Australia, dairy, milk and logs from New Zealand. All the commodity producing countries sold masses of simple commodities to the Chinese, who then turned it into really complicated products and sold them to the rest of the world and made a fortune, right? Because they're smarter, right? So they figured it out. And so, yeah, okay, there is probably some of the benefit during that period was because of the free trade agreement, right? But to think that all of that benefit during that period was due to the free trade agreement does not stack up when you look at what happened to all the other commodity producers in the world over that same time period, because we all were selling commodities into China. So yes, there are benefits, I guess, but when you look at the empirical evidence, it's hard to spot them, right? The Australian Productivity Commission is extremely sceptical of preferential trade agreements. It's extremely sceptical of all the economic benefits that are promoted for them, because it says, everyone says there's billions of dollars of benefits, but they seldom turn out. And certainly on the Australia-US free trade agreement, they turned out to be right. The trade deficit increased for Australia.
Thank you. Go for it, lecture.
So we just sat on the select committee for the South Korean free trade agreement, and it was called a free trade agreement. But after approximately, 2,000 tonne of dairy milk powder to South Korea, our tariff rate goes right back up to 176% on our milk powder, and it will never change. So that's our free trade agreement. 30% of our seafood exports to South Korea under the South Korean free trade agreement still, and it will never change, have about a 40% tariff rate on their trade under this free trade agreement. And most of the other products that were in this free trade agreement don't become free trade for decades. So there's a fundamental question right there. And I would support the words of Dr. Norman about the Australian example and about trade taking place anyway. Most of the trade, for example, into South Korea, New Zealand's growth in trade has grown by almost twofold without one. Over the past couple of decades. So you do have to question the fundamental benefit of these trade agreements. But actually, you'll be surprised. I now want to come back to ISDS. And the question was, will it benefit New Zealand businesses? And I put it to you that ISDS will absolutely not benefit small businesses or even New Zealand businesses of any size. And the reason for that is because ISDS creates an uneven playing field. Only foreign corporates can sue under ISDS with these trade agreements. So if the government decides that health and safety on the farm is a priority, and now we're going to have all these health and safety legislation come into force, and it's going to cost you quite a bit more. If you're a foreign corporate and it's interfering with your profit, it's likely you can sue and win. Now that puts them in a different place to a New Zealand farm which has to like it and lump it and carry on that cost. So ask yourself, where is the level playing field just on an economic basis if New Zealand companies like it and lump it, but foreign ones can sue? They'll go to the government, you've just cost me $1 billion worth of revenue. I'm going to sue you, and they get that, or some sum, and they offset the cost of production. Suddenly New Zealand firms aren't competing on a level playing field. I tell you, it will not benefit New Zealand businesses at all.
Thank you, Fletcher. All right, everyone, we come to our last Facebook question, and it's for Dr. Russell Norman. Can you, in 3 minutes, can you please explain the process of the United States certification? And do you think that New Zealand has already seen some laws passed to bring New Zealand in line with US certification, such as the loss of tea breaks and other laws reducing worker rights? And how does this relate specifically to the TPP?
So I'm not an expert on certification, so I'm not going to claim to be. But I mean, basically, once the US signs a trade agreement, then the Congress has to certify that the other agreed, that the others who have signed up to the trade agreement, they have to certify that we have implemented all the necessary components to ratify that agreement. But what it means is that when you have a negotiation, you kind of think, even if it's, say, there's two parties to the negotiation, they negotiate together, then they reach an agreement, and then that's the agreement's reached, right? What happens with certification is that one of the parties then decides for itself whether it thinks you've passed all the necessary things to actually reach your side of the agreement and can force you to pass new laws in order to do it. The reason why we know so much about it is because of the Australia-US FTA, where the Australian Parliament was basically rushed back together to force through a whole series of laws because the US government decided that through the certification process the Australian government hadn't written the laws exactly right. And so they helped them write them so that they were exactly right. So they certified that the laws that they were passing really were the laws as they thought the agreement meant. And it's kind of humiliating. And essentially, and this has happened to a whole series of countries in trade negotiations with the US, where the US embassy in that country has basically written the laws or has sat down on the shoulder of the legislators as they put the laws together to make sure that they are as the US government says they should be. I'm not aware of any certification issues in New Zealand with regard to the second part of that question, tea breaks and so forth. I don't think that there's been any of that kind of certification issue for New Zealand at this stage, but of course we haven't had a trade agreement with the United States, so I guess we'll find out if TPP goes ahead.
Can I just add something?
Sure.
We did, of course, had a government that was willing to sell out our labour laws and to call a pig a cow, which was what they did in respect of the Hobbit legislation. They said that even if you are taken on as an employee, we will call you an independent contractor. And they did that on behalf of an American corporate in a way that was quite unprincipled, Which leads me really to one final point.
Sure.
In respect of this, and that is, it is wrong that the National Party are not here today. There are thousands of people who are worried. What's that? There are thousands of people who are marching in the streets throughout New Zealand because they're worried about the TPP. And whether they're right or wrong, they've got a right to express their concerns, and they should have a government that engages with them. And it really annoys me that this government has become so arrogant that they don't think they have to explain themselves to New Zealanders, and that they can just go away. We're seeing it with Macaulay at the moment over the Saudi sheep stuff as well. These guys seem to go to foreign jurisdictions where they still haven't got the internet or mobile phones. They are just not accountable for the decisions that they take that impact upon us. And I really abhor that, because I value democracy. And although they might disagree with me, I will always turn up, and so will we, always turn up to explain our positions, because people in a democracy have got a right to that, because that's how democracy's meant to work. So kick these buggers out at the next election.
Yeah. Before, it looks like we will have just a little bit of time to take questions from the floor, but I want to ask the rest of our panellists in about 1 minute or so just to wrap with their final comments. Marama.
So actually I want to address this comment, because Marama's not here on behalf of National Party, and I want you to be clear about that. This is why. We go into an agreement of confidence and supply with the government, and the one thing we have to agree to is the budget. Every single thing else we can vote against the government on, and we do. We have an independent voice so that we can articulate the views of the Māori people so that the government will hear. So when the government are stalling over plain packaging, I can walk into the Minister's office and say, this is not good enough, this is what we want to do, here's our plan, here are the people who are going to help me, are you going to commit to doing that? I could not do that if I'm sitting on the opposition benches, because they just go, sorry about it, shut the door. Now that's why we go into government, and it doesn't matter for me actually which government is in, because I can tell you right now, under a Labour government, under a national government, these things have been happening to our people for a very long time. Now it's happening to the rest of New Zealand, and we're all jumping up and down about it. Well, welcome to my world. Now I want to tell you, thank you very much, I want to tell you that under this government, when they decided that, oh, hello, sorry, you can't take a case to court, that we've all heard, oh, we want the multinationals to be able to go to court. Well, when Māori people tried to take a case to court for the foreshore and seabed, what did this government do? They changed the law, because they can do that. Now, so for me, it doesn't matter which government. I'd go to government with a Labour-led government. I'd go with Russell. And I'd go with New Zealand First, even though they don't want to come to a race-based party. But I would do that, because to not do that would be swept underneath the carpet again for another 170 years where our sovereignty has been denied. Now, we signed a treaty agreement in this country that said we are entitled to our rights and our privileges as the Indigenous people of this country. We signed that, and we have been fighting for that agreement in this country for 170 years. So yes, I'll go into government so that I can continue to fight and have an independent voice for our people, because we have been denied that voice in this country under consecutive governments, red or blue, it hasn't mattered, for 170 years. Kia ora for that.
Oh, closing address, go for it. No, you go then. I'd hate to leave you out.
Back to the TPPA debate around
About sovereignty, same debate.
It is actually, to be fair. So certification, Russell outlined it actually quite nicely for someone who professes not to be an expert on it. And add to that we can't know what was in the negotiations and what was talked about for 4 years. And then the Americans are going to come in and tell us, well, these are the laws you need to change. But how do you communicate that to the people of New Zealand when you're about to change laws, when you can't actually, for 4 years, talk about the content of the trade agreement? It just Makes no sense. And so I talked about that when I stood up first up. This double-edged sword of certification and the ISDS is just an abomination and is a blatant, absolute attack on New Zealand's sovereignty. And when you have that in a trade deal, I honestly do not care what the numbers look like. Thankfully, the numbers look terrible in terms of actual trade benefits. But when you have certification and ISDS packaged in there into a trade deal, you cannot sign that on behalf of all New Zealand. And I'll just keep it at that, actually.
Just to pick up on something Fletcher was saying, the 4-year rule, people may not realise, as part of the terms of the negotiation, all the supporting documentation, all the governments have agreed to this, all the supporting documentation outside of the treaty itself is suppressed for 4 years, so you're not allowed to see it. So when an official went to a negotiation and they got a briefing from an official which said, this is what it means for us, right, explaining to the minister what is it, because it's very arcane, this stuff, right? You won't be allowed to read that. We won't be allowed to read any of that material that explains it, all the supporting documentation around it. We'll just get the text of the treaty, which will be ginormous and really complicated, right? That's all we'll get. We won't get all of the documents around it that explain it to us for 4 years. Of course, in 4 years, all of these things, they hope, will, if it all goes ahead, it'll all be knocked off, right? And then we'll find out what it all means, because then all the documentation around it will be released. This is a deeply cynical behaviour, right? This is a group of people who are behaving in secret, suppressing basic democracy, and I reckon it's worth revisiting, because I see this as in some ways the continuation of the neoliberal revolution that failed, right? Remember, we just had the global financial crisis where the centre, the very thing at the very centre of the global free market, the finance system, right? The thing which above all else was the epitome of the free market, right? The thing that didn't need government support, right? The thing that didn't need all you dirty old taxpayers and all your rules. That thing which was so efficient. That thing which just got bailed out by every one of us here all over the entire planet by the state intervening to prop up all of the financial system. Like that whole project, which was based on that, it's failed so amazingly and publicly that the only place where it can carry on is in the secret corners, in the corners of the room, where they don't want you to know what's happening in the negotiation. You're not allowed to read the text. You can't even read the supporting documents for 4 years after they sign it. Right? That project is carrying on, even though it has massively and ostensibly and fabulously failed. Like in the biggest failure you could possibly ever imagine. We had to put trillions of dollars into the finance system to save it. And this was supposed to be the thing which epitomised the free market in action, which didn't need government support, right? That thing failed, that thing, and is now only surviving on life support from governments and the state all over the planet. That's the only way banks are currently surviving, and the finance system is life support from the taxpayer. That system failed, right? That whole project failed. And so they carry on in the corners and they try to impose it on everyone through these trade negotiations, which have so little to do with trade. So little to do with trade and so much to do with global governance and what will be the nature of that governance. And I think that democracy should be a central part of any global governance framework.
Thank you. Okay, before we wrap, we've got a few final moments to take some questions from the floor. When I say final, not too long. No speeches. So at random, I'm going to choose anybody, and you can shout your question to the floor. Let me start with you. Hello.
So you guys have all spoken against this agreement, and what are you going to do to really stop it from actually coming to fruition? Is there anything you are going to do or anything we can do?
David Parker, could you answer that, please?
Well, you're revolutionary.
The greatest push against this is actually the push of the people and other parties, but in the end the government, if they sign an agreement, it binds the country and it will get pushed through by the government. They don't have to get any act of parliament to sign the TPP. That power lies with the executive. And then consequential legislation which changes tariffs or patent laws, for example, is voted on a case-by-case basis, but it doesn't affect the agreement, and the government would have the numbers to push it through. The more difficult question is what you do if you're a succeeding government and it is in place.
Yeah. Are you going to answer that?
No.
All right. Yes, one that's doing a wave. Hello.
Hello. My question is to everybody, but especially to my question's to everybody, but especially Mariama Fox. If there is benefit in this trade agreement, then what is the government's reasons for not releasing the text? And are you, Mariama and also others, prepared to support a bill in Parliament to force the government to release the text?
Thank you.
Kia ora. Thank you. Absolutely. We've the thing about having an independent voice is we can vote whichever way we like, and we would like to vote against it, but the government doesn't have to bring it to a vote. They can do whatever they like, and they have the numbers without us. So with winning Northland, that gives a bit of a squeeze on the government. They've got a majority of 1 if we don't vote with them, and it's come down pretty close. Fletcher's bill came pretty close, majority of 1, the government passed it. All we need to do though is convince 1 other. Some pressure being applied to the right people might help, but the thing is that they can pass this. They don't have to put it to vote.
A new bill
To say release the things. Or for a start, somebody would have to get it through a member's bill. It would need to be pulled out of the ballot, and then we'd need to be able to vote on it in Parliament. We could all vote for it. All of these parties here could vote for it, but unless we get one of the government's other support partners to vote for it, then it won't matter. So pressure applied in the right places, I say.
Sir with the hat on, go ahead.
You all talk about protecting democracy. I would like to know if any one of you or your parties would support a binding public referendum in general and a binding public referendum on the TPPA specifically.
I'm happy to answer that.
Go for it, David.
Yeah, I'm actually not a person who favours referendum-based government. I think most of the really good things that have happened in New Zealand that confer rights upon people would not have got the majority vote when Parliament put them through. I like representative democracy, where you elect parliamentarians to take decisions on your behalf, and if we get it wrong, you kick us out. So kick these guys out.
Sir, go ahead.
Have you eyed the soft spot or the soft people in the National Party? I think that's the only hope, that you can turn 1 or 2 who feel that they are betraying New Zealand from within the National Party.
Which one?
Go for it, Fletcher, just briefly.
So the unfortunate reality, and I don't know if you picked up on it before, is that with this process on the TPP, there is no longer a need for anything to be passed through legislation. So when the national backbenchers tell you they don't know what's in the trade deal, they really don't know what's in the trade deal because their leadership isn't telling them. They don't care to tell them, they don't need to tell them, because they have the mandate as the executive. So when the TPP is signed, I imagine it'll be signed by Grosser, John Key and maybe Joyce. And those will be the only people who will have been a party to it. So we were hoping, New Zealand First was hoping to have aired a discussion and get a robust debate in the House through the Foreign Corporate Control Bill. But, and we tried to put pressure. There were some amazing campaigns from the TPPA action groups across New Zealand on Dunn, for example. Even David Seymour had pressure applied to him. I gave a few names which I won't repeat publicly, but that obviously didn't help either. So if Japan, Canada and the US don't stick to their guns about being very selfish about their agriculture, and somehow we do come to signing it, it won't be signed by the National Party or Parliament or the Select Committee. It'll be signed by a Select Three, and that's it, unfortunately, now.
All right, we have time for one more question, but you're more than welcome to ask the politicians questions after this. And yes, in the white top.
How have we ended up in such a dictatorship like this? It's a huge question, and also, why would they pass something like this when there seems to be almost no benefit at all to us? I don't know who to ask the
I
answer.
wouldn't mind having a go at that. Because the thing is, isn't it horrible? It's horrible, isn't it, feeling powerless? Having all your decisions made on your behalf, like you don't know what you need to survive, like you don't know what you're talking about. It's horrible. It's horrible having people just determine for you how you should live your life and sign your life away and tell you that your thoughts and your feelings and all your cultural beliefs don't matter. It's horrible. And so I agree with you, and it takes a revolution. It does. It takes a revolution of people power. The more people who stand up and march and tell the government that they don't want this, the more they will have to stand up and listen. Across the world, people are going, don't do it, don't do it. And different governments have caved and let out some details of things. But you know what? When the foreshore and seabed legislation and 40,000, I reckon 40,000, they say less, but I reckon 40,000 people marched on Parliament to tell them not to do it. Well, they did it anyway, but that was the last election they got through.
Do you think we're being listened to at all these days? Times seem to have changed.
No, I think they know what's best for us. I think they know what's best for us.
And they're supported by
To vote against them. Thank you very much. Vote against them.
Vote against their budget, that would count.
Oh, look.
All right, we're going to give the last word to Dr. Russell, and then we have to
Vote
wrap.
against these guys as well.
All I wanted to say was we kind of think of history as a kind of linear progression, and whereby we achieved certain democratic rights in the 19th century with the Reform Acts, which extended the franchise to men, and then to women and all the rest, right? And then 1967, Aboriginal people in Australia got citizenship. So we kind of imagine there's this kind of linear project of democracy and rights, but I just don't think it's linear at all. And so each generation has to fight these kind of battles for their basic democratic rights and civil liberties and all the rest of it. If you look around the world at the moment, there are a lot of pretty grim things going on. I mean, Mexico right now, we're negotiating with Mexico. They are killing journalists left, right and centre in Mexico at the moment. Just so many journalists are being killed in Mexico. And we're negotiating with them as if this is some perfectly responsible, reasonable thing, right? It's like, come on. I just think that we are part of a global movement of people who are having to refight the basic fights for democracy and civil rights all over again, because there's nothing that guarantees them except an enlightened and active bunch of citizens. There is no other guarantee. Every piece of paper, or call it a constitution or a law, whatever you like, guarantees nothing. Right? It is only people like us in this room and all around the country and all around the world. That is the only guarantee of civil liberties, civil rights and democracy. And so we are just having to refight the battles that kind of in our mind, I think, at least to myself, I grew up thinking were done and dusted, and that we'd sorted them out. Actually, it turns out they never get sorted out unless people keep fighting for them and keep winning them back. So that's, I think, what we're doing.
Thank you. All right, guys, I think our organisers want to say a few words, but I just want to thank the organisers, It's Our Future Christchurch, for organising this event. I know it's hard to do, so a round of applause for them. And a round of applause for our panellists, please. David, Russell, Martabat and Fletcher, who have been very passionate tonight. But also what's important is, despite your political leanings, I want to thank each and every one of you for taking the time to come out tonight, regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum, regardless of your passion or otherwise. It is good to see a decent-sized crowd, so give yourselves a round of applause. And just a quick note, the organisers want me to say that there is a register you can sign on your way out, and they're also raising funds for a movie, which is Russell Brand, should be quite good as well. So thank you for organising this event, and Charles, I'll leave it to you. Have a good night, everybody.